Hello, lovely people. Ready to measure? Did you measure your system? Yeah? Okay, let's do this one. So as I promised in my previous video, we went through the moving microphone method, how to use this microphone, how to take the measurements, and now we're going to jump into the actual measurements and we're going to measure everything. So as I promised in the very beginning of all this video series, I said we're going to start with something very, very relatable, and we're starting with a 2A in the front, which is these tweeters, these mid-bass drivers. In the crossover video, we crossed them at about 3K and 80 Hertz. And for the subwoofer, because my system is not very conventional, so what I did to make it a bit more relatable, I put a sealed subwoofer in the back behind the seats like everybody else does. So in this case, this is an Alpine HDZ1110 subwoofer. It's 11-inch in 2 cubic feet, 2.5 cubic feet sealed enclosure. Yes, it is oversized, but I don't care. And I just put it there, just temporary, because I don't want to scratch anything. It is on standoffs, because this is a position where most people have their subwoofers in, is just right behind the rear seat. So one tip, whenever you're putting a subwoofer, if it's a sealed, make sure that the driver is on the opposite side than the actual driver where you're sitting, because if you're going to put the driver in this side, it's going to be slightly worse. So better results is always the bigger the distance to the listening position. Ideally, you want to put it in this corner or in here, as I have with my IB subwoofer. So typical two-way with a subwoofer. Let's jump into the laptop and I'm going to explain you all the measurements in extreme detail. If you didn't watch my previous video, I explained how to take these measurements with REW, with a DSP. We have these are all the measurements. Watch the previous video how to do this, and now let's analyze this. Okay, so if you watched any of my previous videos, you've probably seen me doing this quite a lot. I call this RTA evaluation. And in this video, we're gonna go through just these measurements, and I'm gonna try to explain them in a very simple terms, as always in these series, back to basics, just for everybody to understand. So in this, we see subwoofer, we see two mid basses, and we see two tweeters. At the bottom, the red one is the floor noise that I recommended to measure. And now we're going to cover each measurement individually. Before we do that, we do have kind of a standard that on the y-axis, where's the SPL, we want to see a 5 decibel scale, or something like this, or another plus like this. Just because if you zoom out too much, if for example, I'm going to do this, you can see that everything looks, even like this, everything looks flat. But it's not because of the scale, because I see a lot of times people post measurements in like 50 dB scale and they say, oh, how my system is looking is everything is okay. But you cannot see anything from this. So make sure you have your y-axis on 5 dB scale, so 555, and x-axis 20 to 20. Now here at the bottom we have the noise. You can see I did say that I recommend measuring about 25 dB above the noise. So this is quite a lot more, which is great. And all the other measurements are above that. Now, if I'm going to remove everything and I'm going to show you just this, you see these two peaks. So I did say that I'm going to explain what they are. In my car, and every car is slightly different, I have something buzzing in the dash, and I have no idea what it is. It's something to do with the, I don't, maybe aircon, maybe something, but something is constantly buzzing at around 200 Hertz. And if you can see, if I'm going to take subwoofer measurement, and I'm going to remove this, you can see this peak here. And this is why it's very useful to have the measurement of the noise to know what to ignore. So when I'm going to be looking at the subwoofer measurement, I know that this peak is not caused by the subwoofer, it's not a resonance or anything, and I can ignore it. Now, if that peak would be much higher, and your, for example, mid-bass response would be much lower, this peak would show up in your mid-bass, but now it doesn't show up because there's a big difference between the noise and the actual measurement. So noise is very useful just to know what to ignore. So left tweeter, and right tweeter. So these are both of my tweeters, and as I mentioned, they're crossed at 3.5K. We crossed them exactly this. I left the crossovers exactly the same as we did in the first video, where we set up the crossover, so it's kind of safe crossover. Now I know that I can cross these tweeters lower, but this is pretty much what we see. And as you can see, this is not as people think that below 3.5K everything just drops off a cliff and there's nothing there, but in reality it's a very, very gradual rising thing. And you can see that it's not flat like the response itself. It's actually rising all the way up to 10 kilohertz, and after that it's falling down. Now, how to interpret these two measurements? We can have a look at just one because both of them are exactly kind of the same. What we want from a tweeter is not to have any major peaks. We mainly concentrate in areas such as like 3 kilohertz here, 5K, 7, 8K, something like this. And each of these areas are going to sound a little bit different. So for example, this little mountain at 10 kilohertz, if you would remove it with EQ and just toggle that EQ band on and off, you would probably notice there would be more pronounced like cymbals and very, very high tones with the EQ band disabled. So when you have that extra energy, but it comes to a point where it could sound not nice and not natural and a bit too much on the top end. So that's why you would want to remove this a little bit. Now, for example, look at this 6K area. This is something similar to the region where you would have the sibilants, where the S's are. So if you would have this peak a little bit more pronounced, a bit bigger, then in like lyrics where you have S's, that would be much more pronounced. If you remove this, like maybe 3-4 decibels, then that sibilance would potentially disappear. And in some cases you would have a lot of energy around 3K area, 3 kilohertz, and that just most of the time sounds harsh. So what people say like focal tweeters sound harsh. Not really, just because a lot of them have quite high Q, and then you would have much more energy in this area. And when people don't use EQ, just with the crossovers, they have that energy that sounds harsh, and that's why they say that focal tweeters sound harsh. But it's not the case. It's just the amount of energy that you have in a certain band. You could say that these tweeters do fall off above 10 kilohertz. They do fall off and the response is rolling down. But in reality, if I'm going to take like this line, we can say that it has a little peak between 5K and 13K, and these two little peaks would need to be pulled down, and then you would have kind of a flat response all the way up. You could boost the top end just a little bit, and then you would have a perfectly nice response. So the question is how this curve in reality should look like, because I'm telling you this is a peak, this is like how it should be ideally. We can check it. REW has a very cool tool which is EQ tab. So if I'm going to take this tweet, I'm going to click on it and I'm going to go here on the EQ. It opens a new window just like that. I'm going to minimize this, and in this window we see the actual response that we have, and we see the target. So this is the blue line, which is the targets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to target settings, and I'm going to select a target for a tweeter, which would be base limited. And as I mentioned, we set crossover 3500 hertz, and then it's going to be 24 dB roll off. And then I need to bring it down a little bit just to match it with the actual response. So target level over here, if I'm going to put my mouse here, it's about 50 decibels. So I'm going to enter, instead of 75, I'm going to enter 50, enter, and this is my target. Then in this one, I'm just very quickly going to change it so we could see it a bit better. 20K, there we go. So here you can see that this is how the response ideally should like. Ideal 24 dB slope crossed at 3.5K should look like this blue line. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit just to show you just like that. And I'm going to remove just a tiny bit more down, just like that. And you can see from this that the actual tweeter response is following the target. Very, very nice, apart from this area. So this area will need to be tamed or tweaked with EQ. So you could potentially do it by ear, but it's very difficult, especially for a newbie. The easier way is to use tools, modern tools that help you to do that, which is REW. What you can do, if you're gonna go a little bit lower here, these are your filter tasks. So this filters is basically your EQ bands. You can do it manually. If you're gonna click on this one, here you have all your EQ. I'm just gonna choose PK. I have no idea what PK means, but so look, if I need to tame this one, this little mountain, this mountain is at, let's say, 10 kilohertz. So I'm gonna enter 10,000 hertz, and then I'm gonna cut it. How much do I cut? I need to cut from 54.5 down to 48. So I'm going to cut it by 6 decibels. So here I'm going to enter minus 6 dB, press enter, and here you see now it's a dip in there. But I need to make it a bit wider because I don't want, you can see it goes down, but I need the EQ to cut quite a lot. So do you remember how to do that? If you answered in your head that we need to change the Q of the EQ band, you're very correct. So here the Q is 10, and if you remember what I said, Q of 10 is very narrow, and we need to make it wider. And in order to make it wider, we need to reduce this number. So instead of 10, let's enter 1. And look at that. One EQ band flattened the response for you. So if I'm going to toggle it on and off, you can see that one EQ band did the whole job. Now the other thing, you could fix this one. So probably minus 6 is a bit too much. Let's put minus 5, just like that. And then let's remove this little peak. This peak is at 6 kilohertz. So let's choose it. PK, 6,000 hertz. And this is little, so let's do minus 2 decibels. And the Q, we need to change it again a little bit, maybe 3. And you can see it removed this. So it removed this one as well a little bit, like this area here. Now it's a little dip. So you can take another band and just boost it a little bit. And the thing is, like manually, you can play and play and play with this. But REW is cool because I'm going to remove these EQ bands. It does everything for you automatically. And all the settings are here. So what you do is, I'm going to select the range and tell REW where I need to fix this response. So I'm going to fix it from this area somewhere, because when you EQ, you need to EQ the slopes as well. So I'm going to choose from 1439, all the way up to 20 kilohertz, all the way up to here. So I'm going to leave it like this. Now, individual mass boost, overall max boost, you can enter 6, you can enter 10. It doesn't really matter as long as I mentioned, just be mindful and look at the overall boost. And flatness target, if you choose 1, is going to try to match your response to the target as much as possible. If you choose like 2 or 3, is going to allow for a bigger difference between the target and the response. So let's choose 1 and let's see what REW does. Match response to target. Okay. And this is basically what it did. So it did fix the slope because I chose the target plus minus 1 decibel. If I would choose a higher, maybe like 3 plus minus 3, and do that again, it just barely touched the slope. But in general, you can disable these. Let's, for example, disable the slope just to see. So 1, 2, and 3, let's disable. And we have these 2 bands, 4 and 5, that fixed this hump that we had. And you can see it's very close to what I entered. So I entered 10K, and I entered 6K, and I entered minus 6 and minus 3. So it's very, very close. But you see, REW does everything like mathematically, so it gives you exact values. So when you have these values, you just need to put them into the DSP. So here we have DSP, we have the tweeter, and what we're going to do, we're going to enter them. So Q value here, which is from this one, 3094. So it's just approximate, we can put 3. Then you click enter and it drops down to the next one, which is gain. The gain here you see minus 3.2. So I'm going to enter minus 3.2, enter. And then the frequency 5908, 5908, enter. Then this jump to the second EQ band. Second EQ band is 1461, 1.461, enter. The gain minus 5.7, enter. And frequency 10,276 Hertz, enter. So now we can see this EQ is applied in the DSP. And if I would remeasure the tweeter response after this EQ, then I would get this flat response. And this is basically how you EQ. You can do it manually, as I showed you in the very beginning, but it's just easier to use REW built-in tools and just simplify the workload, because you can spend hours and hours do it manually, but the tools are there, so use it. So left and right, you can see the right one is very similar. It has a little bit more stuff happening, but it's very similar. So the right one, in my case, is the driver side. And here, at about this frequency, 3.5K, we do have a little dip, which we didn't have on the left side, which is the passenger side. Now, this dip could be caused, as I mentioned, due to the reflection from the driver's side window. Now, how to verify this? You could roll the window down and take another measurement, or put something very, very soft in front of the window, like a pillow or something, or a blanket, and take the measurement and see if this dip disappears. If it disappears, it is a reflection. It's just now I'm speculating that this is a reflection because it's the only difference between left and right. And you would follow exactly the same procedure for EQing. You choose this one, you go to EQ, select the target, and you can do this. So tweeters are quite easy because usually tweeters have a good response if they are installed right and correctly. If you would have tweeters installed like in the dash firing up the glass or off axis, this would be a total mess. So as I mentioned in the very first video, install is key in having a good initial response. But even in this, just the top needs a little bit of taming, and then you would have a very nice response. Now let's have a look at the mid bass, because mid bass is just, it's a mess everywhere. So we have a left mid bass and we have a right mid bass. So this, you can see it's not as flat, and it has a lot of dips, peaks and valleys and everything happening. Let's have a look at the left one, which is the passenger side. So this is a kind of a typical response of a door mounted mid bass drivers, where you have a falling response below like 70-80 Hertz. Most of the time it just drops like off a cliff, just because there is one cancellation just below the crossover frequency, and this cancellation is caused by the length of the car. Now, how do I know this? I took the response, which is this one, the green line, with no crossovers applied. You can see this is our 80 Hertz crossover link with Riley, and this is 3.5K. So the 3.5K just chops off the top end, and the 80 chops off this. And in this response, without any crossovers, we can see this little, it's not little actually, a dip in the response. And this is caused due to the length of the car. As I mentioned, the standing wave that kind of cancels everything. And in my particular car, this happens on my left mid bass, it happens on my right mid bass, and it happens on my subwoofer, on all the drivers. Some cars have this, some cars don't. So in my car, like 65 to 70 Hertz is the worst location in like frequency range, because it's a cancellation in my driver's seat. And what is the solution? How to fix this? How would you have a nice response in there? You put a front subwoofer that covers this range, and this is exactly what I have in my car. I have a front subwoofer that covers specifically this range. All these cancellations are covered by that. So let's go back to the left mid bass. We have this, as I said, it is a cancellation, you cannot do anything. The top end is kind of fine, it kind of rolls off. If you would have a speaker that is more full range, because this one is kind of mid bass and it's supposed to be used with the mid range speaker as well. However, it is being sold in a two-way. but you can see the top end kind of rolls off. So a more mid-range speaker would have this top end much more linear and you wouldn't have this roll off, but this one just rolls off. With a crossover, obviously just rolls off even more. But the biggest thing that we see is this dip at about 450 hertz, something here. It's a massive suck out in the response, and this is in the very middle of like proper mid-range where you have the most vocals and like the most instruments, and this is very noticeable. And to be honest, you cannot do really much. As I mentioned with the boost in the EQ video, you could boost this area, but you're not gonna boost much, maybe 5-6 decibels. So you can see 5 dB scale, 1 grid. So if I'm gonna boost 5, it's gonna end up here, but I'm still missing like close to 10 decibels. And you cannot boost 15 decibels without any sacrifices, because if you're gonna boost 15, you're not gonna get loud. This is gonna be distorting this area. And this is one of the main drawbacks of a two-way system. So first one is the meeting point, the crossover between the tweeter and the mid-range. I'm just gonna talk about this a bit later. And the second one is that in most cars, you will have this suck out in the mid-range. And it is speculated, but I think that it's due to the center console and stuff that's happening like in the passenger footwell and stuff. So yeah, it's not nice, but it is there. So this is the left one, which is the passenger side in my case. On the driver side is this, which we do have something similar, but is not as severe. However, on the right side, we can see this. So this is a massive hole of like 15 decibels. In some cars, it's much wider. In some cars, it's very narrow, this dip. In some cars is 120, it could be 130, it could be 180, it depends on the car. And this cancellation is called a driver side null, which basically happens in every single car that has mid-bass mounted in the door. Now, if you know anything about frequencies and what instruments play these frequencies about 150 hertz, it's where your upper note of the kick bass lives. So the main kick lives about 60-70 hertz and the upper harmonics in about 150 hertz. So with this massive hole, you will have missing information and the kick bass, the kick, is not gonna sound nice. No matter what drivers are you gonna put, no matter how much power you're gonna give, because there is a natural suck out, the cancellation caused by the cabin, by the actual car, you're not gonna fix it anyway. It's impossible to fix it. The only way to fix this is to put a driver in a different location. And that's what we do in SQ. Instead of doors, we use kicks, like my other drivers are in kicks in Infinite Baffle. And in the kicks, you don't have this. And the frequency range is covered much better. Now, I took this one without the crossovers as well, just to show you. So without the crossovers, exactly the same. And here you have another suck out, which is the length of the car cabin cancellation. Now we see something here, very narrow. This is extremely narrow. This is not going to be audible, and I'm not actually sure what it is. It could be a resonance. Maybe the panel is vibrating and absorbs all the energy. But the main ones is this one, about 66, and this one. So when you're gonna EQ this, you're not gonna touch it, because you know, if you're gonna pump 15 decibels into 150 hertz, you're gonna destroy the driver. So these cancellations, you do not fix them, you leave them alone. And that's why it is important to take all the measurements in the highest possible resolution. Let me show you what I mean. If I'm gonna change the smoothing into 1/3, like a lot of people say that, oh, you need to take everything in 1/3 because this is exactly what we hear. If I'm gonna do 1/3, this doesn't look as deep. You would think that you're going to take this, you're going to boost it 3-4 decibels, and you're going to have a nice response. But it's not the case, because smoothing hides everything for you. So smoothing might be a good thing, but if you want to see everything and you want to react correctly with a EQ, it's better not to use it, because it hides a lot of things. And you can see, yeah, it's hiding a lot. Now, let's have a look at the target. How should we EQ this mid-bass driver? If I'm gonna select this one, which is the right one, I'm gonna go to EQ. And EQ, we're gonna do very, very similar thing. Is just, we're gonna select, instead of bass limited, we're gonna select speaker driver, and we're gonna select 80 to, we crossed it, as you remember, 3.5K. And we're going to choose Linquist Riley 24 decibel slopes, just like that, 20 to 20. I'm just going to do this quickly like that. And let's bring the target down to 60. Let's have a look, 60 dB, just like that. So for this, we can see that the response is kind of following the target like that, but it's missing everything here. So basically, if I'm going to keep the same crossover points, like 3.5K for the mid-ranges, it's not going to reach the tweeter response at all, because you remember the tweeter is following that target almost perfectly, but this is so much missing information. And this is the point where in most two-way systems there is a massive problem of mid-bass or mid-range reaching the tweeter. In a two-way system, you want a tweeter that could play much lower. So in this case, let's have a look. If I'm going to reduce the target to 2.5K, nope. If I'm going to reduce the target to 1.5K, something similar, maybe like 1.8. Yeah, so with a little boost here, we would need a tweeter that could be crossed at 1.8 kilohertz. Now, a typical small 1-inch or slightly bigger car audio tweeter cannot be crossed that low. The only tweeters that can be crossed that low are going to be your like home audio tweeters, like the big ones that you literally cannot install in the car. So this is a massive, massive problem. Now, we could try to cross the mid-bass a little bit higher in order for it to reach the tweeter. Let's try to do that. For this, I need to take the response of the right mid-bass without the crossovers. I need to choose a different one. So I'm going to select this one and I'm going to do exactly the same EQ. There we go. So this is a response with no low pass filter on the mid-range, on the mid-bass, and no high pass. So high pass, yeah, we can put 80, but even if I'm going to lower the target a little bit more like this mid-bass driver playing without any low pass cannot reach the target. And again, this is a limitation in most two-way systems where the mid-bass cannot play as high and the tweeter cannot play as low. And this is why a three-way is going to be always a better solution. Now, yes, you could have a different mid-bass driver that would play high all the way, and you could have a tweeter that could play low, and they could reach each other and they could sum nicely and everything is fine. However, you need to select your drivers extremely careful. But as I mentioned, for most typical two-way systems, this is a problem. Okay, so how do we EQ this? What can we do with this? We could try to boost this. If I'm gonna go to EQ tab here, let's see, 2.6K. PK 2600, very wide Q because we need to boost quite a lot. So let's select one and let's try to boost it by 8 decibels. Not enough. Let's try 10 decibels. Not enough. Let's try 12 decibels. There we go, something like this. So in order for our mid-bass to reach the target that we set, 3.5K, we would need to boost 12 decibels at 2.6K. And remember, this is without any crossovers at all. So with a 12 decibel boost, you will clip your signal, most likely, and you will not be able to crank it up loud. Yes, you could reduce your channel gain 10 decibels on the DSP and then maybe it's gonna work, but it's not the way. This is not the way. In this system, you would need a mid-range driver that would cover this range. Now, another option is to choose a very low target. This is what we mean. So if I'm going to choose a target like this, let's say, and I'm going to boost this area just maybe 2 decibels, just to reach it, just so you can see, it reaches just there. But then I will need to cut 6-7 decibels all the way up there, and you're basically losing that free energy. So two-way, in most cases, is going to be with sacrifices. Now, how would you tune this? How would I tune this? Probably I would just leave a gap between the tweets and the mid bass. Because in both of these ways, either boosting the signal, you're going to lose the channel gain, or if you choose a very low target, you're going to lose the level. So in order not to lose the level, you have to make a sacrifice and leave a gap between the mid bass and the tweeter. And literally, this is the only way. You cannot do anything with this two-way. So this is the right side. Let's have a look at the left one. Left XO. Let's choose the same target and let's bring it down to 60. And there we go. And for this side, it's exactly the same. We cannot reach the target to reach the tweeter, even if I'm going to lower this. The bottom end is kind of okay. It's kind of fine. But then we have this. So let's try to fix it and let's see how much we need. So PK, I'm going to choose 440 hertz. Q, let's do 2. And let's boost 12 dB. Something similar. 450 and maybe 14. There we go. Now it looks better. So in order to fix this thing, we need a 14 decibel boost. So imagine, plus if you want to fix that one, let's try this one as well as we tried on that one. How much was it? 2.5K, Q of 1, and another, what, 10 decibels? Yeah. So you can see, like, with these massive boosts, this is not feasible. You can get a response, but you'll have to pull your channel gain by 10 decibels, and at that point, you're not going to have any level. So you see, two-way in bad locations, it's nasty. You cannot do anything with it. Now, if you would have a mid-range playing from like 200, 300 hertz here, the mid-range would cover this. And again, mid-range three-way saves this response. With the two-way, you cannot do anything. With two-way, it's just limitations, limitations, limitations. Again, unless you will invest quite heavily in driver selection, in measuring your car, maybe changing the install a little bit. But in most cases, it's just much easier to install a mid-range driver to cover this area and to cover this area and let the mid bass play literally only the mid bass frequencies in here. Now, as the last thing, let's have a look at the subwoofer. So this is my subwoofer response. This is with no crossovers. This is with an 80 hertz crossover. So you can see the crossover, it just literally chops off, which is fine. Perfect. We have a little dip here because we will want a response to go like that up, but there is a scoop out. And again, this scoop out, about 67 hertz, is due to the length of the car. And in my car, it happens with all the drivers. Your mileage may vary. If your car is longer than mine, probably this is going to be in slightly lower frequencies, maybe like close to 60 hertz. If you have a shorter car, this is going to happen in higher frequencies, maybe like 70, 75 hertz, but all cars will have this. Now, we do have a rising response and we have this peak, and then we have the extension. So since I have this driver in oversized sealed enclosure, I do have a response going all the way up to 20 hertz and even lower than that, down to 12. So it does measure. It's not going to play very loud, obviously, because it's a small driver, but this is closer to IB, which is called infinite baffle, where you have the response all the way down. So when you put a driver like in a sealed enclosure that is too big for it, you will have this response, but this bass below 25 or so, it's not going to be very well controlled. So it's just a response, but it's not going to sound as nice. Most sealed enclosures will have a peak somewhere around 45, 50 hertz, and then they're gonna roll down just like that. And you're not gonna have much like below 30 hertz. So in order to fix that, because what we don't want the subwoofer to be boomy. Boominess is the extra response that we have about 50, 60 hertz. If you're going to take your subwoofer measurements, and you will see that there's a peak somewhere about 50 hertz, cut it down. So let me show you. I'm going to take this subwoofer response. Let's go to EQ. Now, with the EQ window with subwoofers, you cannot really put a target because you need to make a target, because subwoofer targets are very, very different. But I can just show you how you should cut it down. You take this peak, whatever you have, like 45 hertz, PK, 45 hertz, Q about 4 or 5, and let's cut it down by like 7 decibels. There we go. And now we can see that before and after. This peak goes away, and all the boominess, all the dirtiness from the sub bass goes away as well. Yes, you're losing a bit of energy, but the sub bass is going to sound much, much nicer. What you want from a subwoofer is just literally a rising response if you go into the lower frequencies. So a flat subwoofer is not like, if you're going to take a line here, it's not this flat line. A subwoofer needs to go up with the lower frequencies. Only then is going to sound nice. This is going to sound a little bit boomy. If you have just a one massive peak, that peak needs to be chopped down. And there's going to be another problem, probably you noticed, probably you didn't, that due to this cancellation here that we have about 65 hertz, there will be a little gap between the subwoofer and the mid bass. So all in all, if I'm going to enable all of these drivers, just to very quickly summarize how you would tune a two-way system. Probably tweeters would need a little bit of work just to chop off something. With mid-bass, you cannot do really much, to be honest. You can try to fix these little mountains, but in a two-way, due to cancellations, due to this, you cannot do much. Because it's pointless to boost even, you can boost 5 decibels, 6 decibels, but it's pointless because it's not gonna even make a dent. If you need a 12, 15 dB boost and you're boosting only 6, you're not gonna even notice it, and the drivers are gonna work much, much harder. Then you have a gap between the tweeter and the mid-bass, you have a little gap between the subwoofer and the mid-bass, and you have loads of missing frequencies. So maybe it's gonna sound harsh, but a two-way system, especially in my car, is just a shit show, literally. And that's why I don't really like two-ways, because some cars, again, some cars could perform a little bit better. They could measure a bit nicer. They could have maybe less cancellations, but some are much worse. Like I've seen, especially like big SUVs with big massive doors, this area, like where the actual mid-bass lives, is just peaks, troughs, and it's a disaster. And some people say, oh, I'm putting like loads of deadening in the door and it's gonna sound nice. No, it's not. It's not gonna sound nice if you have 2 or 3 of these massive dips and another 2 peaks somewhere else. It's not gonna sound nice no matter how much EQ apply, no matter what you do. It's just the location is very, very bad. And with the mid-range, again, you cannot do anything with the mid-range. You need a dedicated mid-range driver to cover like this area, because in SQ you want a linear response, and with this you're not gonna get it. You could get a linear response if I chose the target somewhere here. Then I would boost this 5 dB, I would boost this one a little bit, I'm gonna cut 12 decibels from all of these, I might boost this a little bit, then cut everything from there, but then you're losing 10-15 decibels of volume. Now 15 decibels of volume is a lot, and you would have a linear system that sounds good, but you wouldn't be able to turn it up above like normal talking level. So what kind of system is that, you know? That's why in my system, I have everything custom locations, custom install to minimize all the effects of the cabin and to have a very nice response. So this is a two-way. In the next video, I'm going to show you the measurements of the same car that has these problems with a three-way with a mid-range and with all the stuff that I did in order to make my life easier and for the system to sound nicer. If you want to see how to tune a two-way, like what targets to choose, whatever, I do have a playlist. It's called Show Your Tune. In that playlist, I do have RTA evaluations of different systems. I'm going to leave it in the video description. And there we do have some two-way systems as well. And I do have some two-ways tuned on my channel as well. So that's why I don't go very deep into the actual tuning, but I just want to show you the limitations of a two-way system and what typical problems you're going to encounter when you're going to measure your system. With ported subwoofers, you're going to have probably a peak, and potentially you could have the response rolling off like somewhere here, and then you have a bigger gap than even that I have. You might have less problems in this area, you might have more problems. But if you want to share any of the measurements that you took, if you want any kind of advice, what to do with it, how to EQ or how to what, please join RTA in Cars Facebook group, because there we do this. We do these measurements, we analyze them, and we give advice, and we're trying to help people. But for this, that's been it. Next one is going to be a three-way. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one.